Yeah, I do, Yoon-jun replied, pulling up a holographic display of the battle. First question, why are you fighting them where they want to fight? They've got bigger guns and stronger shields, so ship-to-ship combat is exactly what they're hoping for. Because that is how space battles are conducted, Ziktal replied stiffly. Civilized warfare has rules and honor. Lee Hanna let out a short laugh. Honor doesn't mean much when you're dead. Second question, why aren't you targeting their supply lines? Every one of those Cytherian ships needs fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Where do you think all that stuff is coming from? The coalition officers looked at each other blankly. It was clear that none of them had even considered attacking non-military targets. In their minds, war was fought between soldiers, not against infrastructure. Third question, Park Dae said, his voice getting colder. Why are you defending this station at all? It's not moving, it can't retreat, and it's a giant target. You're letting them dictate the terms of the entire battle. Admiral Veltar's eyes blinked in confusion. This station is our primary defensive installation. We cannot simply abandon it. Why not? Choi Min asked. What's more important, keeping a building or keeping your people alive? As they spoke, the human veterans were already working. They had been quietly requesting supplies from the station's quartermaster, things that seemed completely random to the coalition staff. Civilian cargo ships, mining equipment, communications jammers, and thousands of tons of basic industrial materials. What are you planning to do with mining explosives and construction drones? Asked Lieutenant Velshin, a young coalition officer who had been listening to the conversation. You'll see, Park Dae replied with a grim smile. But first, we need to know everything about Cytherian logistics. Where do they refuel? How do they communicate with each other? What happens if their command ship goes dark? The coalition officers were starting to realize that these humans thought about warfare in a completely different way. While the aliens focused on honor, formations, and traditional tactics, the humans were already thinking 3 steps ahead, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. As evacuation alarms continued to blare throughout the station, the human team spread out to different sections, each one gathering information and resources for a plan that none of the coalition forces could have imagined. The real war was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. While the coalition fleet prepared for what they believed would be their heroic last stand, the humans had already vanished into the darkness of space. Admiral Veltar kept looking at his tactical display, confused about where the human ships had gone. One moment they were docked at the station, and the next moment they had simply disappeared without any formal orders or coordination meetings. Where did they go? He asked his communications officer, a nervous-looking creature with tentacles instead of arms. Unknown, sir. They left 3 hours ago in different directions. Some went through the quantum gate, others just jumped to hyperspace. They wouldn't tell us their destination. 3 systems away from the main battle, Sergeant Kim So was crouched behind a rocky asteroid, watching a massive Cytherian supply depot through her scope. The facility was huge, easily the size of a small moon, and it was completely undefended. The Cytherians had never imagined that anyone would be crazy enough to attack their rear supply lines during a major battle. This is almost too easy, whispered Corporal Hanju, who was lying next to her with a pack full of explosives. They've got enough fuel and ammunition here to supply their entire fleet for months, and there are maybe 20 guards total. Kim So had been fighting guerrilla wars since she was 16 years old. Back on Earth, she had learned that the best way to kill a snake was to cut off its head, but the second best way was to starve it to death. Remember, we're not trying to destroy everything at once. We want to create a slow leak that they won't notice until it's too late. Her team of 12 humans moved like ghosts through the supply depot. They had studied Cytherian technology for weeks, learning how their systems worked and where the weak points were. Instead of setting off massive explosions that would alert everyone, they carefully sabotaged fuel pumps, damaged ammunition storage containers, and planted viruses in the computer systems that would activate hours later. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Bai Huan was leading a completely different kind of mission. She had taken a small fleet of civilian cargo ships, the kind used for hauling mining equipment and construction materials, and was approaching a Cytherian communication relay station. To any outside observer, it looked like a simple merchant convoy that had gotten lost. "Remember, we're just innocent traders who took a wrong turn," she told her crew over the radio. "Act confused and helpless until we get close enough." The Cytherian patrol ships barely paid attention to the slow-moving cargo vessels. In their minds, civilians were beneath notice during military operations. They had no idea that each of those harmless ships was packed with combat veterans and enough firepower to level a city block. When Bay 1's ships got within striking distance, everything changed in seconds. Hidden weapon ports opened up, and the cargo ships transformed into assault vessels. The communications station was destroyed before the Cytherians even understood what was happening. Back at the main battle, the coalition forces were starting to notice that something strange was happening to their enemies. The Cytherian fleet, which had been moving with perfect coordination for hours, was beginning to show signs of confusion. "Admiral, we're intercepting Cytherian communications," reported the signals officer. "They seem to be having trouble reaching their command ships." At the same time, other human teams were executing equally unconventional attacks. Specialist O-Min had taken a group of combat engineers and was using modified mining drones to plant explosives on Cytherian ships from underneath. The enemy sensors were designed to detect incoming missiles and fighter craft, not tiny repair drones that looked like space debris. Corporal Young Da was running psychological warfare operations, broadcasting fake emergency signals on Cytherian frequencies. Her team had learned enough of their language to create panic-inducing messages about imaginary attacks, supply shortages, and command failures. The enemy fleet was starting to receive dozens of contradictory orders from sources they couldn't verify. The humans fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen before. They didn't line up in neat formations or follow ancient rules of engagement. Instead, they hit targets that seemed completely random, but were actually carefully chosen to create maximum chaos with minimum resources. Captain Kim Juno coordinated the entire operation from her flagship, but even she was impressed by her team's creativity. "Status report," she called out over the communications network. "Supply Depot Alpha is leaking fuel at a rate that will cripple their cruiser squadrons in 6 hours, Kim So reported. "Communication relays in sections 4 through 7 are completely dark," added Bay 1. "I've got 3 Cytherian destroyers firing at each other because they think they're enemy ships," laughed Youngda. The Cytherian fleet, which had seemed unstoppable just hours before, was falling apart. Ships were running out of ammunition, captains couldn't reach their commanders, and entire squadrons were getting lost because their navigation systems had been quietly hacked. Admiral Veltar watched his tactical display with growing amazement. The enemy armada of millions was being systematically dismantled by fewer than 500 humans who refused to fight fair. These weren't the honorable battles described in military academies. This was something completely different, something terrifyingly effective. The tide had turned, but the coalition still didn't understand how. The Cytherian flagship Death's Edge hung in space like a massive black dagger, 3 kilometers long and bristling with enough weapons to destroy entire planets. For 6 months, this ship had been the terror of the galaxy, leading the unstoppable armada that crushed everything in its path. Its commander, War Prime Thekvar, had never lost a single battle in his 40-year career. Captain Kim Juno stared at the enemy flagship through her cockpit window, her hands steady on the controls, despite knowing what she was about to do. Around her, 19 other small human fighters moved in a loose formation that would have horrified any military academy instructor. These weren't sleek, expensive warships. They were patched together attack craft that looked like flying junkyards. "All units, this is Juno," she said into her radio, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Remember, we only get one shot at this. If we miss, everyone dies." The plan was insane by any reasonable standard. They were going to ram their ships directly into the enemy flagship's hull, using their vessels as guided missiles to create breaches that boarding parties could exploit. It was called wolfpack ramming, a tactic that had been developed during Earth's bloodiest wars when desperate soldiers had no other options. "Ma'am, are you sure about this?" asked Lieutenant Ko Jin, flying the fighter to her left. He was barely 20 years old, but he had already survived 3 major battles that would have given nightmares to veteran coalition officers. "Kid, I've been sure about a lot of stupid things in my life," Juno replied with a grim smile. "This might be the stupidest, but it's going to work. The Cytherian defenders never saw it coming. Their sensors were designed to track missiles and torpedoes, not suicide attacks by manned fighters. Warprime Thekvar was standing on his command bridge, confidently directing the final assault on Station Omega-7, when his tactical officer suddenly screamed in alarm. "Sir, multiple small craft approaching at maximum speed. They're not responding to our warning signals." Thekvar barely had time to turn toward the view screen before the first human fighter smashed into his ship's hull. The explosion tore a hole 20 meters wide in the armored plating, sending shockwaves through the entire vessel. Before the crew could react, 3 more fighters struck different sections of the ship, each one piloted by a human who had accepted that they weren't coming home, but that was just the beginning. As planned, 5 fighters had been held in reserve, waiting for the breaches to open. Captain Kim Juno's ship roared through the largest hole, followed by her boarding team. The interior of the Cytherian flagship was a maze of twisted metal and sparking electronics, but these humans had trained for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. Marine Sergeant Odar was the first one out of Juno's fighter, his assault rifle already spitting bullets at the stunned Cytherian crew members. He had fought in urban warfare back on Earth, clearing buildings room by room in battles that lasted for months. Compared to those hellish experiences, fighting inside a spaceship was almost relaxing. "Move, move, move!" he shouted to his team, leading them through corridors filled with smoke and debris. The Cytherians were tough fighters, but they had never faced enemies who were willing to die just to get close enough to hurt them. Odar's team fought their way through 5 levels of the ship, leaving a trail of unconscious and wounded enemies behind them. Their goal wasn't to kill everyone. It was to reach the command bridge before the Cytherians could organize a proper defense. At exactly the same moment, computer specialist Nam Su was working his way toward the ship's central computer core. He had been hacking alien systems since he was 12 years old, back when Earth's different factions were constantly trying to steal each other's military secrets. The Cytherian computer security was advanced, but it was designed to stop outside attacks, not someone who was physically inside the system. "Almost there," he muttered to himself, dodging laser blasts from Cytherian security forces. His fingers danced across a portable computer interface, breaking through layer after layer of encryption. "Come on, come on." Meanwhile, demolitions expert Hong Gi was having the time of his life in the ship's weapons bay. He had always been fascinated by things that exploded, and the Cytherian arsenal was like a candy store to him. Instead of destroying the weapons, he was carefully reprogramming their targeting systems. "Let's see how you like getting shot by your own guns," he said with a dangerous grin, connecting his equipment to the main weapons console. The 47 seconds that changed everything began when Odar's team burst onto the command bridge. Warprime Thekvar spun around in shock, reaching for his sidearm, but the human sergeant was already moving. A single shot from Odar's rifle dropped the Cytherian commander, and within seconds his team had secured the entire bridge crew. At exactly the same moment, Namsu's computer virus activated throughout the ship's systems. Navigation went dark, communications failed, and the life support systems began shutting down section by section. The mighty flagship was suddenly as helpless as a floating piece of debris. And in the weapons bay, Hong Gi's sabotage reached its climax. The ship's main guns, which had been preparing to fire on Station Omega-7, suddenly swiveled around and began targeting other Cytherian vessels. The flagship's own weapons opened fire on its escort ships, creating massive explosions that lit up the darkness of space. In those 47 seconds, the most powerful ship in the Cytherian fleet had been captured, blinded, and turned against its own forces. The armada that had seemed unstoppable just moments before was suddenly leaderless, confused, and under attack from their own flagship. Everything had changed in less than a minute. The surrender message came through exactly 3 hours and 22 minutes after the flagship had been captured. Admiral Veltar stared at his communications screen in complete disbelief, as Warprime Thekvar's successor formally offered the unconditional surrender of the entire Cytherian Empire. "This cannot be real," muttered Commander Ziktal, his forearms trembling as he read the message for the 5th time. 6 months ago, these same Cytherians were unstoppable. They crushed our best fleets like insects. How can they be surrendering to a handful of humans? Around the command center, coalition officers from dozens of different species were asking the same question. The Rigelians, who prided themselves on their strategic thinking, couldn't understand how the battle had been won. The Centaurians, famous for their military discipline, were completely baffled by human tactics that seemed to have no rules at all. Captain Kim Juno walked onto the bridge of Station Omega-7, still wearing her battle-damaged flight suit. Her hair was singed from the explosion during the ramming attack, and she had a bandage wrapped around her left arm. But she was grinning like someone who had just won the lottery. "Well, that was fun," she said casually, as if she hadn't just single-handedly changed the course of galactic history. "Anyone got coffee? I haven't slept in 36 hours. Admiral Veltar approached her with a mixture of awe and confusion written across his alien features. "Captain, I must ask, how did you know this would work? The Cytherians had never been defeated before. They were considered the perfect military force." Kim Juno shrugged and accepted a cup of coffee from one of the coalition staff officers. That was their problem right there. They were too perfect. When you always fight the same way, eventually someone figures out how to beat you. Colonel Park Day joined the conversation, followed by the rest of the human veterans. They looked tired but satisfied, like workers who had just finished a difficult but successful project. To them, this had just been another battle in a lifetime of battles. "The thing you have to understand," Park Day explained to the gathering crowd of alien officers, "is that humans have been fighting wars for our entire history. We've tried every possible strategy, made every possible mistake, and learned from all of it." Lieutenant Commander Lee Hanna pulled up a holographic display showing Earth's military history. The timeline stretched back thousands of years, showing conflict after conflict, war after war, with barely any periods of peace. "Look at this," she said, pointing to different sections of the timeline. "We've fought with swords, guns, tanks, aircraft, nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, space battles, guerrilla campaigns, siege warfare, naval battles, psychological operations. You name it, we've done it." The coalition officers stared at the display in horror. Most of their species had achieved peace within centuries of developing advanced technology. The idea of fighting continuously for millennia was almost incomprehensible to them. "But why?" asked Lieutenant Velshin, a young coalition officer who looked genuinely disturbed. "Why would you keep fighting each other for so long?" Sergeant Choi Min laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Lots of reasons: resources, territory, ideology, religion, revenge, sometimes just because we were bored. Humans are really good at finding excuses to fight. The point is," Kim Juno continued, "we've learned things that you can't learn from textbooks or simulations. We know what it feels like when everything goes wrong. We know how to keep fighting when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. We know that sometimes you have to sacrifice the few to save the many." She used a term that made several alien officers step back in shock: acceptable losses. In coalition military doctrine, the goal was always to minimize casualties, to find solutions that saved everyone if possible. The idea of deliberately sacrificing some troops to achieve victory was considered barbaric. "We call it total war," added Specialist Nam Su, who was still covered in soot from his computer hacking mission. "When your survival is on the line, everything becomes a weapon. Supply lines, communications, morale, civilian infrastructure, enemy psychology. It's all part of the battlefield." Over the following weeks, human military advisors spread throughout the coalition fleet, teaching concepts that revolutionized galactic warfare. They introduced ideas like asymmetric warfare, where smaller forces could defeat larger ones through superior tactics. They taught the importance of flexibility, adaptation, and thinking outside traditional military doctrine. The results were immediate and dramatic. Coalition forces that had been losing battles for months suddenly started winning. Enemy fleets that had seemed invincible found themselves outmaneuvered by commanders who had learned to think like humans. But not everyone was celebrating. Admiral Veltar found himself lying awake at night, thinking about what he had witnessed. The humans had saved the galaxy, yes, but they had also revealed something terrifying about themselves. "They're not just warriors," he confided to his aide, one evening staring out at the stars. "They're the ultimate predators. They've spent thousands of years learning how to kill each other more efficiently, and now they're teaching those skills to the rest of us." His aide, a nervous creature with large eyes, nodded uncertainly. "But, sir, they're on our side now. They saved us?" "Today, yes," Veltar replied quietly. "But what happens tomorrow? What happens when their interests don't align with ours? We've seen what they can do to enemies. Do we really want to find out what they might do to former allies?" The galaxy had been saved, but it would never be the same. Human military doctrine became the new standard, taught in every coalition academy. The peaceful, honorable warfare of the past was replaced by something more ruthless, more effective, and infinitely more dangerous. Humanity had taken its place, among the stars not as explorers or diplomats, but as the ultimate warriors, creatures forged by endless conflict into something both magnificent and terrifying. They were invaluable allies and potentially devastating enemies, and the galaxy would have to live with that knowledge forever. The age of genteel, civilized warfare was over. The age of human warfare had begun.